Negotiated Rulemaking, How to Get Involved, featuring Anne-Marie Wiseman, Senior Director, Policy Development, Analysis, and Accreditation Services.
Hi, and thank you for joining me for today's session on negotiated rulemaking. We have a lot to cover, and I'd like to get started right away. The first thing that we'll talk about is an introduction to negotiated rulemaking. And the second thing that we're going to cover is how you can get involved, both before, during, and then even after rulemaking sessions. So first, that kind of educational information about negotiated rulemaking, what it is and why we do it. The first thing we do at the department is we plan for negotiated rulemaking. Now, keep in mind that the Higher Education Act that governs the Title IV programs asked us to do this rulemaking anytime we're changing the Title IV regulations or initiating new ones. We're to do that whenever practicable. And most of the time it is. We find that we develop better rules or regulations when we have the entire community involved. Getting information from the regulated community ensures that we consider all of the things that we should consider that you face when we're regulating you. Remember that there are many different constituencies, and we'll talk about who some of those are coming up. But the key thing to remember is that our most important stakeholder, and the one that is always present, is the student. So we always have student representatives on our rulemaking committees. So again, backing up to talk about how we plan. We first announce that we're going to do a rulemaking effort, and we conduct public hearings. Now, rulemaking, when you look at the totality of it, can often be an 18-month project. It is not a quick process, but we have involvement from the public along the way. We get that first input at the public hearing. We generally have 2 or 3, occasionally 4 of them around the country. One is almost always at the Department of Education offices in Washington, D.C. And then we hold them usually at institutions around the country. And we rotate those locations so that people have access. What I'd like to point out, though, is that you're not required to attend a hearing in person. You can always submit testimony, and it holds the same weight whether you're in person or whether you deliver it electronically to us. We read every comment, we listen to every bit of testimony, and we consider that when we're developing our proposals. And we also consider it when we think about what other topics we might want to regulate. You may identify something that we hadn't realized we needed to have regulations on, or changing regulations. So that input is particularly valuable to us. We also then put out notices to solicit nominations and select negotiators. Our final planning step is that we select and then notify non-federal negotiators of their roles. We're selecting both primary and alternate negotiators in each constituency that we have. Then again, a little recap of what negotiated rulemaking is. Our idea here is bringing together all of the relevant stakeholders as well as department officials to try to reach consensus on language and major concepts that we plan to put in our negotiated rulemaking documents that we end up with. And the typical one there is an NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So we propose those topics, we hold the sessions, and then afterward, the NPRM is kind of the outcome of those sessions. And again, we'll talk more about this coming up. We also then collect and summarize public feedback. So that's another opportunity for involvement. We get information on the NPRM, we publish a final rule, and then we still answer outstanding questions about the regulatory process. That might be done through webinars, through conference sessions. It can be done through guidance, information in the handbook, or electronic announcements. There's various ways that we can do that. But we want to make sure people understand what we've done through our rulemaking process. So how do we identify these issues that we want to negotiate? First, we're looking at whether new regulations or amendments to regulations are necessary. Remember, as I mentioned, Title IV regulations generally need to go through the negotiated rulemaking process. People often refer to it as neg-reg or even reg-neg. It's very important. We take very seriously that idea of negotiating. We really do want it to be a partnership with you. We want to consider your input, and we want to make sure that we avoid any unintended consequences that you might be able to help us prevent. We often publish reports on major actions that we plan to do in the near future and even in the long-term planning for the agency. So we want you to consider what it is that we're planning and then think about how you might impact those decisions. We publish notices, and they are all in the Federal Register. We often cross post those to our own websites for additional information as well. We announce all of the public meetings in advance. We announce notices selecting nominations for negotiators. We sometimes put out additional information requests if we don't receive enough nominations. So those notices are all going to be available to you online. And again, we use public feedback to help develop our list and the notices that we do publish. So you might be curious to know how we actually hold negotiations. Typically, they've been held in person in or near the department's offices in Washington, D.C. We usually have 3 sessions each of anywhere from 3 to 4 days each. And those sessions occur over a period of months, usually one a month. The ultimate goal, though, is reaching consensus. And the way we do that is, again, through strong negotiation. We want to make sure that people have the information they need to come prepared for those negotiations. So we draft either regulatory language or we draft proposals that talk about what the issues are that we want to negotiate. And we give that out in advance of the first meeting and in between meetings so that the negotiators can read what we plan and what we're going to cover. The other thing that we want them to do is to get information about what they need and what you need to have good regulations. And we'll talk about that coming up. Negotiators can form subcommittees to work on specific issues. And sometimes when we know that there are a number of issues to negotiate, the department actually forms subcommittees in advance. And by doing that in advance, we can assure that we have the right people at the table. So what specifically is consensus? Sometimes people think consensus means that everybody's happy and everybody likes the outcome and it's exactly what they want. As you know, when you're dealing with 20 or more people, it's difficult to get something that everybody loves. Hopefully, everybody's comfortable and everybody feels that what we're doing is reasonable and going in the right direction. But consensus really is no dissent by any member of the committee. So people basically are saying, I got some of what I want and I can live with the rest. Everybody won't necessarily love everything, but we want it to be livable. We want it to address the needs of you and your constituents. Absence or silence of a member when we're actually taking a vote means that you have not dissented, and that could allow consensus by the rest of the committee. And once we reach consensus, a member is not permitted to withdraw their consensus. You can't change your vote later to say, no, I don't want consensus after all. So what do we do after the negotiations end? Hopefully consensus was reached, and then we have a much easier task because we know what the language is that's going into the NPRM, or the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. The department determines whether to proceed with the regulation, and typically we do. And then if it's reached, we use that information. We go ahead, we share the preamble language generally with the negotiators. We will generally use that identical language. There are times that we make slight adjustments, but typically that is only for something that we realize later violated statute or other law, or if we have technical corrections. It can be anything from subject-verb agreement to we referred back to another regulation and got the numbering wrong. We try to be very careful of that during negotiations, but errors do happen, and we want to make sure that we have an accurate document as much as possible. We can actually depart from consensus in the final regulation if we receive a public comment based on that NPRM. And we'll talk about public comments more coming up. Remember, if consensus is not reached, though, the department can change any of the language that we use during the drafting phase in negotiations. We can use a portion of it, we can use all of it, or we can use none of it. Generally speaking, I think we try to use as much of it as possible. We try to use the informed discussion that we had. We draft the preamble language, and it's generally not shared with the negotiators in advance of publishing that NPRM. So the final steps are that we publish that notice in the Federal Register. We give a public comment period, which is usually at least 30 days, sometimes longer, depending on the complexity of the regulation. If consensus is actually reached, the negotiators and the people who they represent cannot comment negatively on the regulatory language. If we've all come to consensus, that means we have basic agreement that this is the right path forward. Comments that are used to develop the final regulations come from members of the public. They could come from negotiators. They could come from anyone in the community. We summarize those and we address them each in the preamble. Now, when I say we address them each, we're addressing each unique idea. So that may not address every specific comment with every specific thing said, but every idea that's attached, everything that's unique, we do address in some way. We provide an explanation of why we're going to do what the commenter asked or why we're not. And I think that's really helpful when you read the preamble to get some context to understand what we discussed at negotiations, any deviation from it, or any addition to it. And then we publish final regulations in the Federal Register. Keep in mind there is another requirement within the Higher Education Act that guides our rulemaking process, and that's the master calendar. The department needs to publish regulations on or before November 1st of any given year so that on July 1st of the following year, those can take effect. The Secretary can designate any regulation or an entire package for early implementation, and that gives people the option to implement them early, but not a requirement. Now, this idea of how long we give you, we're giving you 8 full months to prepare for regulations that we're putting in place. That's much longer than what most agencies do. Typically, agencies can put things in place 30 days after publication. We give you 8 months, and the Act requires 8 months for a very specific reason. We know that our programs are complex. We want to make sure you have adequate time to prepare, and we want to make sure that your systems are ready, your staff are well trained, that your students are educated, and you have time to update any policies and procedures that you need to do. So in recognition of that, we give you plenty of time to go. Now, as I mentioned, the second part of the presentation is to talk about ways to get involved. We really need your input. And so as I mentioned, there's the before, during, and after. Before negotiated rulemaking, we have the public hearing testimony. During it, you could serve as a negotiator or an alternate negotiator. You can also provide input or feedback to your negotiator, whoever represents your constituency. And in some cases, that's more than one person. You can also make a public comment. During negotiated rulemaking sessions at the end of each day, we provide time for public commenters to come and speak to the committee. Typically, we give people about 5 minutes per comment. So you could come at the end of each day, or you could come one day. And like with our public hearings, you're not required to attend in person. Many people like to do that, but it is not required. And so you can send in a written statement that would be read for the committee to hear if you're not able to travel to the actual session. And then after sessions, you can again submit those public comments on our proposed rule. And again, we read each one. So let's take a little deeper dive into how you get involved. I mentioned the public hearing testimony. We've presented that list to you of what we're planning to negotiate. You can also add to it. Once we look at that list, we determine who the people are that should be involved. So that's when we're kind of pulling our stakeholder list and we're saying, who are the relevant people that need to be involved in this? And remember what I said at the beginning, students are always a relevant committee member. They are always a stakeholder in this process. You can present that information to us in person at the public hearing or in writing. We sometimes have people who are representatives of multiple people reading in person, but again, you can submit those electronically as well. Public hearing testimony is available to everyone. The public hearings themselves are open to the public. Usually you get a 5-minute block. We typically ask that you schedule them in advance versus same-day slots. We do, if space is available, we do allow people to come day of and sign up for a time that day to speak, or speak on the spot if no one is scheduled for that time period. It helps us to get organized to know how many people we have scheduled if you schedule in advance, but we always want to allow for some last minute spur-of-the-moment testimony if that exists. We have you speak on topics that are in the notice or other topics that you identify. So again, we talk about what we plan to negotiate, but we also are open to what you think is necessary. And we typically hold these at least a couple of months before negotiations start. Often our schedule is that we want to start the negotiations in January, And so if we're doing that, we back up to see how much time we need to prepare. And so public comment and the public hearings are typically held in the summer, in June or July, maybe into August. But we want to have plenty of time to be able to review that testimony and make sure we have a solid agenda and that we know the stakeholders that we need. So when we're in negotiations, you can serve as a negotiator, you could be an alternate, or you could just be a constituent or a member of the public. So you might wonder how negotiators are selected. Remember that negotiators can be self nominated or nominated by others. It's always helpful when someone is nominated if there are letters of support for others, if possible. We want to make sure that the people that are selected to negotiate have enough contacts or enough ability to make contacts within their constituency so that they're gathering information from all of the affected stakeholders. We want to make sure that people understand they're no longer just representing their institution, but they're representing their entire community. And that community could be any number of communities. We try to have representation from all of the stakeholders, which could be, in many cases, institutions. And so when we have institutions, we make sure that all sectors and all types of schools are represented. So we have representatives from the proprietary sector, private nonprofit, as well as public. And sometimes we break it out into 2-year and 4-year institutions or small and large institutions, but we want to make sure that there's adequate resources to make the decisions that we need to make. And remember, as I said earlier, students are always a negotiator. We always have representation because they are a key stakeholder in all of this. And we typically find them through national student groups, but others sometimes self-nominate, and that's very helpful to us. We really appreciate the service that the negotiators provide. They do a really good job in representing you and your community, and they do a lot of homework. There's a lot of reading material before, during, and after the sessions, in between especially. We usually have a month in between sessions, and they are probably reading during much of that month. The committee can consist of usually at a minimum 15 negotiators and then an alternate for each. Often because there are so many people that want representation, we end up with 20, 21 even. We always have a department negotiator, and I've been fortunate enough to serve as the department's negotiator on multiple packages, and it's been a really rewarding experience for me. I've had a chance to work with many, many wonderful negotiators who come with great passion and great care for students and the programs that we administer. And they are very enthusiastic about getting to the best product that we can get to at the end. And I think that's been very helpful to us. We also have a facilitator, and thank goodness we do. The facilitator helps us to keep on task. We often have a very large slate of issues to discuss, and the facilitator makes sure that we have enough time to get to all of those. The facilitator, who also usually has a backup, makes sure that we take breaks, make sure that we have the documents that we need to, or that information is on the screen in a way that people can see it. Takes care of a lot of little details that we sometimes forget about. And that's very helpful to us as we all work together during the process. So negotiated rulemaking, people often ask if it is open to the public, and yes, it is. Members of the public can come and observe. Note, though, that they can't speak unless recognized by the committee. There is that daily public comment period at the end where negotiators listen to the members of the public, usually in 5-minute blocks each. And also, if someone is unable to attend in person, they again can submit testimony to be read. And again, typically we'd expect that to take 5 minutes. If there is no one able to represent that person, then the department would actually read it on behalf of the person submitting it. There are caucuses that can be held where negotiators do private meetings. They might want to go in a smaller group and have just a subsection of the full committee. Those are open to the public at the discretion of the committee. So the committee can decide, whoever is having this caucus, if they want to have an open or a closed caucus. And regardless of how we're doing these discussions, keep in mind that social media and technology have widely increased the availability of information about our rulemaking. We know that there are people in the public who are there sending out information in real time so that people know what's going on. And sometimes that means then others will want to comment more, and that gives more involvement, which is helpful to us. We make printed materials available to the public upon request, and we also post the documents that we are going to be discussing on our website. Now, how do you get involved after the session? Remember, I mentioned the NPRM, that's our proposed rules. You are always welcome to submit public comments and provide feedback to your negotiator who represented your constituency. They may wish to do a comment as well. Now, when we talk about public comments, often we talk about how many comments we received. And people think it's very impressive when we receive large numbers, typically thousands of comments, as we often do. I would say, however, that we're responding to ideas, not numbers of comments. So don't think of it as a vote as much as think of it as providing perspective on issues. If you have 50 people sign off on a comment, sometimes it's more effective to have them sign off on one letter or one electronic comment rather than submitting 50 different things that say the same thing. So you may want to get together with others that are part of your same community or similar communities and submit as a group. That can be very helpful to us as well. When we have written public comments, that's your way of responding to the negotiated language or the language that's the outcome that the department created if we did not reach consensus. There are ways to create strong comments, and some of those, as I mentioned, would be grouping comments with others. You can submit your comment typically electronically, but you can submit on paper. Part of the idea of the comment is to consider what we've already proposed, and then you can say if you agree with it or disagree with it. But ideally, if you disagree with it, it's really helpful if you can tell us why you disagree with it and what you propose as an alternative. The more you can propose, the more we can react to that idea. And again, we just might adopt it. It's very helpful if you're specific. And also, if you have numerous parts of regulations or numerous regulatory citations, it's very helpful if you can identify specifically which regulatory topic you're commenting on, and if you can organize them by that topic, and if possible, even in the order that we address them in the NPRM. It helps us to follow your comment and make sure that we've responded to each unique idea. And then be sure to submit them in a timely manner. The system does close if you're submitting electronically. It closes at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on the day that the public comment period ends. That is a public system, and we have no control over the closure of that, so we cannot extend it once that deadline has been established. Just a couple of quick tips about responding to comments. And these are examples only, not items we actually plan to negotiate at this time. These are, in a sense, maybe some silly examples, but it's helpful to isolate what we're looking for in comments. A rather weak comment would be to say, I love what the Department of Education is proposing. It's great. Well, typically, as I said, we have multiple things within an NPRM. We have multiple regulations, multiple parts of regulations that we're negotiating. Tell us very specifically what you like or what you don't like. A stronger comment there would be to say, I agree with the proposed regulation on loan counseling, and then talk about data and talk about why you support it. That can be really helpful to us. The more detail you can provide us about why you agree with something or why you don't, the better we are. When you're submitting a public comment, you submit those online at regulations.gov. You'll get an immediate confirmation. Remember only to submit your public comment once. Don't submit online and then by mail as well. Just submit one time. And consider reviewing comments that are already submitted before you write a public comment. That might give you something else you want to comment on, or you may want to support something already submitted. I've given you some slides with some screenshots here about how to view comments on regulations.gov. We're not going to go through each of these comments and each of these slides, but they are there for your reference if you choose later to go back. Here I've listed some resources for you, especially the Federal Register website can be very helpful to you if you've not reviewed that already. And then I have a link to our rulemaking site that we've used in the past. We do one for each rulemaking effort that we have. I'd like to thank you very much for attending today's session. I hope that you found it educational and informative. I invite you to send comments to me. My email address is here within the slides, and either I or a member of the staff will get back to you. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.